Hello and welcome to the second installment of Tutorial Tuesdays. We're going to continue working on creating this image. Today we are going to focus purely on creating the city of gold. Not necessarily the gems, not necessarily the objects in the environment, just creating and texturing the city of gold and this pit of lava right here. And I'd like to also get into some compositing today, and this is going to be quite the undertaking. It's probably going to take a while. So let's get started. This is the viewport as it starts out, and this image, by the way, took an hour and 8 minutes to render for the 1920 by 1080 render because interior renders take very long. So what we're going to be doing is separating out each object and texturing them in their own respect and then putting them all together for the render, because that way if we're working on each object individually, the render times will be much lower for testing. So today we're going to try to zoom through the modeling rather than spend a lot of time on it, because I would like to focus mostly on texturing, because that is what makes this look good. So we're going to start by creating the bricks. We're going to take the default cube, and the first bricks here are beveled out. So what we're going to do is take these two edges and bevel them. So we're going to select both of these edges and hit Control B to bevel them out like that. And then we're going to up the segments to make them nice and round. Very cool. So then we can do the same thing with the rest of the edges, like so. Except, wow, that is causing issues. Oh, okay, I see what's happening. We didn't select all of it. Okay, so we're going to round the edges just a little bit like so. This is going to give us some n-gons, but it will not be problematic. So then these bricks actually need to be much thinner, like actual bricks, and we're going to GY to center that up. Then what I did is I used the array modifier to create a bunch of them, like so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, we're just going to go with 7 because that seems like a pretty good number, and we're going to center this guy up as much as possible. Then we are going to create more bricks, like so, scale them down. We're going to try to match the height and width of these bricks right here, but these bricks aren't going to have the nice round edge like that. So, scale X, the software is lagging behind some because I'm going a little bit fast, and also it's lagging behind because of the recording software. Then we're just going to hit Control B to bevel this and just round it enough like that. Very cool. So then we're going to move it over to match up with this one, and we're going to do array count 7. So now we have two sets of bricks, and we want this to go pretty far back, so we're going to add another array modifier, and rather than going on the x-axis, we're going to go on the y-axis by a relative factor of 1. The relative, by the way, puts it exactly at the edge of the previous installment. The constant is a constant value that doesn't matter if the object changes. So for relative, for instance, you'll see if I up this, it'll keep everything at the exact edge of the previous one. So we're going to up the count here, make it go pretty far back, like so. Yeah, I think that's probably fine. Let's go ahead and position a camera so we have a nice camera view. So go ahead and put this guy in camera view. We'll go to this view over here, and we will Alt-R, Alt-G to reset the rotation and location. Yes, I did rotation. Okay, I did say those correctly. Then we are going to change the camera focal length to 24 because I like wide angle lens compositions, and we're going to rotate it some like so, just until it looks nice. I mean, I'll let you do whatever you want with your camera. Hitting rotate X will rotate it on the x-axis, then X again will rotate it on the object's local x-axis. So we're going to do rotate XX to rotate it up like that. And that creates a pretty cool look. Very cool. So then we are going to create the walls. Rotate Y 90. Like so. That should be pretty good. We want it to be about at the edge so there aren't any awkward edges here. We want it to bevel down at the edge. And then we're going to keep this guy's scale at 1. and I'll explain why later. But we want to keep the scale at 1, so we're only going to modify this in edit mode. And we will extrude back. We don't even need to extrude back, so let's go ahead and delete this edge loop. Something like that ought to work. Then it looks like we have more bricks up here. We're trying to basically just recreate the exact same image. I'll let you create your own city of gold if you want to, or something similar anyway. It doesn't have to be exact. But this is looking pretty good, so we will put this right here. Then we will create another wall on this side. It already looks like mine is much thinner than the original image that I created. So let's go ahead and widen up some of these bricks to make the stage just a little bit wider. Like so. Something like that ought to work. Very cool. So let's move this wall over like that. We'll delete these guys, and we will copy and paste these guys exactly how they were. Like so. And then we are going to need another wall right down here, like so, as you can see right here. We'll select all of these guys and move them up some to match. So now we have this beautiful little stage, and we're going to join the two walls, I think, and then make them just a little bit taller. We're keeping an eye on the camera view here. And then we are going to add a ceiling by rotating him Y on 90 and moving him down, like so. We can select you by hitting L, delete you. Object, transform, origin to geometry. We'll center the origin on the object. And then we can scale him out. But we have to make sure we apply the scale because, like I said, we want the scale to stay at 1. Okay, so now we have walls and a ceiling. Now we just need this back wall here, like so, and we need one more wall right here, which, let's go ahead and move the camera back some so we'll be able to see the lava, which will be this plane that I'm duplicating right here. That will suffice for our lava, and then the walls actually need to come further down so they penetrate the lava. So now we have this stage created. We can go ahead and place a light just to test it out. I'm going to go ahead and also save, which needs to go under Documents, Let's Play, Spelunky Art Tutorial _002 _001. Okay, very cool. So now we have this plane here. This will function as our key light, or one of our lights. The lava will act as a major light in the scene too, but let's go ahead and just make this guy on emission for test purposes. I forgot to change it to cycles, which you can do in this menu right here. Change it to the cycles renderer. Change this guy to emission, and we'll set him to about 50, and that should be alright. And right now I'm rendering on the processor. I want to be rendering on my GPU, which will go much faster. Okay, so this is looking pretty swell. Let's go out of render, and now we need to create these columns, and then we'll be done modeling and we can focus on the texturing. I want to try to make this tutorial a bit less complicated than last week's, or a bit less in-depth, a bit shorter. There we go, that's the word I was looking for. So these columns will go down the edges like this. They will also need to be at a scale of 1, and I'll explain that again later when we're texturing. But for the meantime, let's go ahead and add a cube. Set him to 0, 0, 0, so he goes to the center of the column. We want it to be a bit wider than the column. We'll scale it down. Move it down here. Move the column's base up a little bit, like so. Add another cube. Scale Shift Z. We don't want to scale it on the Z axis, just a tiny bit maybe. And then select both cubes and hit Control B to bevel. See, okay, so now the scale, this isn't what I was talking about and not what I'm going to mention later, but we want to apply the scale also because bevels act funny if the scale isn't applied. So we want these corners to be just a little bit rounded like that, and then we will cut you right there, put you at Z0, delete you, and we will mirror him on the Z-axis. We'll also go ahead and apply the rotation just in case. Then we'll apply the mirror and move the column all the way up to the ceiling, like so. So now we have our first column. So we don't want to do twice the work, so we'll go ahead and create an array modifier and offset it until he reaches the other wall, which will be right about there. Will be fine for the purposes of our image since we can't even see this column. Then we are going to create another array modifier, and we want probably 1 or 2 more columns going back on the y-axis, so 0x, 1y. So let's do something like, let's do 2 more columns just for fun. Again, this isn't to create this exactly. This is more to go over the texture process that I followed in creating this. So then we're going to duplicate the columns by hitting Shift D. Then I'm going to lower the count to 1. Move this guy back here, and we are going to move this up on the Z-axis. So now we have columns back there too. Let's take a look at the render. Awesome, we have our nice city of gold. Now let's get to texturing, which is what this tutorial is really all about. So, moving along, we're going to do the bricks first. We're going to select all of the walls. And first of all, optimize their scale, like so, by only doing it in edit mode. Again, we want this scale to stay at 1. And then we are going to start working on our golden brick texture. So we're going to focus on this wall back here for that. So we're going to hit Shift H after selecting this object, and it will select only this object. So how I approached the bricks, since these are flat planes, we don't have to do UV mapping on them. And I'll explain why in a second. But what we're going to do with this material is first set this to rendered. We want to unhide everything really fast. Select the wall. We also want to select our light source when we're working on the textures, because that will give us an accurate representation of lighting. So let's go ahead and save really fast and then save as a new increment. Incrementally saving is a must when you're working on projects. So as far as materials are concerned, we're going to hit new, and that will give us this right here. Now when you're working with metal, you want to mix it a little bit with the diffuse, but you also want it to be majority glossy. So we're going to set this to 0.9 or 0.8, and then we're going to set the glossy color to gold, like so. Because when you have a metal object, the specular highlight will match the color of the object, which means we also want the diffuse to be gold as well. So how I approached the bricks is I'm going to show you in the UV image editor here. I took this image from CG Textures, which is a brick texture, and what I did is I traced over it in Photoshop to create these grooves. A much easier solution would have been to use Crazy Bump, which is software that creates bump maps and normal maps and displacement maps from an image for you, but I did not have access to Crazy Bump at the time, so I just traced over. So we're going to use this as displacement, non-color data, and we're going to open the brickgrooves.jpg. You can create your own. I'm not allowed to share this. And then for the texture coordinate, since this is not UV unwrapped, I used object. So what that allows us to do is, since this guy's scale is 1, the bricks will end up being the exact same scale on every object that has the bricks, rather than UV unwrapping it where it will not be consistent. So if we set this to object, we now have some nice bump mapping here, although it is a bit strong. So to fix that, we can add a converter color ramp and change the white down, crush it down, and that will make the bricks stand out a little bit less, like so. So now we have some nice gold bricks. Let's also make them a bit more reflective, like that. Very cool. So if we look at our original image, you'll see that there was a bit more bumpiness in them, also a bit more yellow. I like the gold that I had previously, so we're going to try to match that, I guess. That's close enough. Okay. So, to approach that, first of all, we want to make these brick... No, I think the brick size is pretty good as is. We can adjust it using a vector mapping node if we wanted to, but we're not going to. So, to get the bumpiness in here, we're going to input, or texture, image texture. We're going to open the original brick image, and we are going to color mix. And we want to use the exact same texture coordinate. The beauty of using nodes is you can use the same node here. So this guy needs to be mixed in by a factor of like 0.01. So now we get some nice brick bumpiness on these bricks, but not that much, just to get a little bit of extra detail in there. We can even crush this guy down a little bit further, I think. Okay, a value of about 0.65 seems to work pretty well. So we can unhide this, and then we can apply the brick texture that we made to all of these objects. And we'll title this Gold Bricks, like so. And in the viewport, we want to know that we're working with this, so let's change the viewport color to yellow, so we know which objects have the bricks and which don't. So now this is not going to be perfect yet. This is still going to be problematic because not all of these planes are going to be rotated the correct way to have the bricks facing the right way. So let's take a look. See, this one is not rotated correctly. So, rotate X, rotate Y. Okay, so we're going to apply his rotation and render. Still not correct. Okay, so to fix this, we're going to hide everything except him and the lights, because the lights are necessary again to view our bump map. Great. Okay, so this gives us just the object and the lights. So let's go over to this view right here. I like to have the window split up into several views because it makes it easier to do stuff like this. So to fix this guy, we're going to go into this view right here. We want to be able to see the specular highlights. It looks like he needs to be rotated like that. Huh. Actually, you know what? Let's just see what this guy's rotation is. So he is rotated 180 on the Y and 90 on the X. So we're going to change this to 180 on the Y and 90 on the X. And then when we rotate him forward, all should be correct. So let's try that. Go into edit mode, rotate him around. This is what happens when you do the object mapping. You have to have everything facing the right way. But we can fix it in edit mode like so. So now if we hide everything except him and the lights, we should have our bricks facing the right way. And we do. So now we have to do that on everything else as well. So you are going to be 90 on the X, 180 on the Y to keep the rotation consistent. Then rotate Z 90, rotate 90, and just move it back into place. Actually, I think this is going to be wrong. Okay, see, I am not that well prepared for this tutorial. It's been like a week since I touched this. I will admit, you caught me. And so far, we're already approaching this very differently than I did previously. Okay, so this is not going to be correct. Let's hide everything except the walls and the light and do some rendering. Okay, so because these are rotated on the... These would be correct if they rotated like this in edit mode, then we need to rotate them back like this in object mode. Just bear with me. I know that's a little bit confusing. Basically, we need the rotations to be different for the side-facing ones than we do for the front-facing ones. Just because of how the texture coordinate system works, it's hard to explain. Okay, so now the bricks are behaving appropriately, which is a good thing. So, this guy is already facing correctly, and now onto the ceiling. So it looks like this guy is also already working. Fair enough, awesome. Okay, why is my, okay, there we go. Okay, the program froze up for just a little bit there again because I'm recording. Okay, moving right along. Now for the brick texture, let's unhide everything. Hide everything except the front-facing walls and the light, just so we can see everything better. All of these have the exact same texture. They are the exact same scale, so the texture will apply perfectly to all of the walls. But let's go ahead and work on our texture. So we have some bumpy bricks, and we have some brick grooves, but we also want some dirt on these bricks. Otherwise, they will not be very believable, or maybe just some color variation. So what we can do to achieve that is we can take this image texture, the bricks, the actual bricks, not the image that I made. Let's try to scale this out. See, brick rounded, the one that I got from CG Textures, totally took. And we can take it and convert it using a color ramp, like so. So if we were to, sometimes I will take a new shader, a diffuse, and plug stuff into it just to test to make sure that it's looking how I want. So we want to crush the blacks and crush the whites, and this will give us some nice grime or some dirt areas in the grooves of the bricks. So we can then take this and mix a diffuse shader with our brick shader, like so. Let's go ahead and plug this back in. And right now it's mixing by a factor of 0.5, but we want to mix it by a factor of this and swap these because we got it wrong. And now we'll have some nice grime. Except we need to change the color. So let's copy this, paste it, and darken it down just a bit to make some nice dirt. And it looks like the dirt's a little bit strong. Also, oh, this image is color data. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and make it a little bit weaker. We just want some detail. We don't want an overwhelming amount of detail. So now we're getting some nice detail in our scratches, which is all good. It also kind of works as a spec map since we're mixing just a straight up diffuse. So I think these bricks look pretty good. Let's move on, and you get an idea of how I approached that. So let's move on to these bricks. So let's select them, hide them. We're also going to apply the same material to the columns. So we will also select them, and we'll hit Shift H. So now we have everything that we want to work on in our view. So I'm going to go ahead and save a new increment just because we got the bricks completed. And these are already at a scale of 1, which is perfect. It means they will all match. So this gold for these bricks, since these are modeled and we don't need to texture in grooves, we can just make a new material here and call it gold matte. Matte for material, not matte for my friend Matt. Then we will do the exact same thing we did before, where we will mix shaders, glossy. Then we can go into our other material. We're not going to apply this to anything on these, we're just going to use it to copy stuff. And we can copy the colors for our diffuse and for our glossy. And let's go ahead and apply this to everything, like so. Alright, we are completely done. No, we are not. I was just kidding. So this guy needs to actually, you can see how he has faceting, looks kind of like a stretched out disco ball. So we're going to set this to smooth, and then we're also going to add an edge split modifier so that the specular will be correct. And we're going to do the exact same thing on this guy. what edge split does is it splits the edges where they are past this certain angle, which on these guys it looks like it's splitting right there, which we don't want, so we can up the angle that it splits at to 80. And it looks like it is still splitting. So another solution, rather than using edge split to get the proper specular on cylinders, is to just delete the faces that aren't visible. So we can select you, delete faces. So now if we render these frontmost columns, why are we getting some really weird looking stuff here? It looks like we have duplicate cylinders almost. Okay, that's problematic. What is happening? Oh, I know what happened. Okay, so we're just gonna hit space to bring up the menu and hit remove doubles, because what happened when we mirrored this, or something strange happened basically, where our vertices got overlapped somehow. So now we are back on track. We're probably gonna have to do the same thing here. Yeah, okay, so space, remove doubles, that will fix our issue. And we will delete these faces. So now all of our speculars should be correct, like so. So now we have this fancy city of gold. But this gold is way, way too perfect. So what I did for the displacement on these is I used a noise texture. So texture, noise, factor, great. Now this is stretched. How we fix that is by using the object texture coordinate, and because all these are the same scale, it will match. Everything matches. Great. We want to up the detail on this because right now it's way too low detail. So now our gold is actually kind of looking like gold. But if you notice in my original image, we made it very interesting by only having this in certain areas. And how you approach that is, you guessed it, we used a color ramp, which allows us to crush the blacks, except we actually want to crush the whites. We don't want to crush the blacks too much, like so. So now we're getting some nice divoted detail, and we can even bring this down so it's not so unbelievably strong. You can crush this as much as you prefer. You can also crush the blacks, but then that just makes it flat like that. We want the detail on the inside, so we're only crushing the brights. And then we can also play with the scale to make this bigger or smaller or whatever we want. And I think that if we up the strength on this a little bit more, this looks pretty good detail-wise. Then what I also did with the gold was I did a mix on the color of the glossy. So color, mix RGB, copy this color before we plug it in because this is about to go away, paste, and then we're mixing it by a factor of noise. And you're like, Chris, that's the same color. Just bear with me for a second. So we also want this to be the object texture coordinate. And then we're going to take the second one. We copied it into both areas because it makes it easier to just darken this to get our color variation. And it looks like, okay, so we're going to copy this, return to that later, Control C. We're going to make this blue just so we can figure out where everything is going as far as the detail and how we want it to get. So we can do a converter color ramp and crush these in, whoa. Okay, it's going slow because I'm rendering at the same time. But we want this detail to show up, so we have to crush this. What we're doing here is basically making it higher contrast. So these will be more white, this will be more black, because the noise by default is not horribly high contrast. Also, I just realized we're using the color and not the factor, which will help a lot too. Color gives you rainbow color noise, factor gives you pure black and white, which is what we really want. Whoa, I did not mean to drag that all the way in, because again it's going slow and not being horribly responsive because of the rendering. that we are doing. So then we can scale this down to about 3 should be good, and then paste the color that we had, and that gives us some nice detail in the gold. Also, I just realized that our gold is not as shiny as we wanted, and that can be approached with the roughness on the glossy node that we're using by putting it down to 0.1. Should be pretty good. Yeah, I think 0.1 will be pretty good, satisfactory. Then we can hit Alt-H to unhide everything, and our city of gold is coming together. For the meantime, what we can do to get rid of all of the fireflies is go to sampling. I'm going to stop rendering here for a second. We're going to go to sampling. Actually, could have sworn it was under, okay, it is under light paths. It's under light paths. Turn off caustics, which will prevent light bouncing through things, and then we can also filter the glossy by a factor of 2 should be good. That will blur the glossy rays a little bit so it doesn't get as much noise. And then we can also clamp the image down to 3. Clamping it says pixel values can be no greater than this, and 1 is already white. Anything above that is a super white, which is what is brighter than white. So now if we render, it should be a lot less noisy. Still noisy, but a lot less noisy. Very cool. We have a city of gold. But I think that the columns and the bricks still need some work on their textures. For me, texturing is a process about tweaking until it looks right. It's not about one set way of doing things. Actually, let's go ahead and place in our other light, then we'll come back to these. So our other light is the lava. So we're going to scale this down like so until it goes up to the wall. And the lava was a tricky one, and I'm still not completely satisfied with how it looks, but it does look cool. So I'm actually going to lower the camera some and rotate it down some just so we can see more of the lava. We only care about what's in the camera view. We don't really care about how the object looks by default. But the lava is going to be a mixture of diffuse and emission textures. Let's go ahead and save. So to approach this, we create a new material, go to the rendered viewport. It'll go fast because we only have 2 objects here. And we want this to be a mixture. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on this as my reference, but I highly suggest looking at actual lava for reference. When I was working on this, I was looking at all sorts of lava reference on Google Images. Google Images is your ultimate repository for reference, by the way. Use it to your advantage because it is there. So, to approach the lava, first, I used a mixture of textures. So we had 2 emission textures. Where are you, emission? At the bottom, right there. And I mixed them. Color, or shader mix, like so. So this is going to be a lot of finicky playing around. So the first one was a very bright yellowy, white, orange type thing. And that will be like an emission factor of 10. And then the other one was a nice dark orange. Like so, but also strong emission. Then, to mix these, I had a mixture of textures, but I started with a magic texture. Like so. So what magic does, let's go ahead and test this with diffuse just so we get our texture right before we mix the emissions. So shader, diffuse, color, surface. So this is what the magic texture is looking like. Also, let's set our preview samples. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit scatterbrained here. This is how I work. I do trial and error until I get something that works. So preview set to 0, that will make it continuously render in the viewport, which is what we want. So to get the nice swirlies, first of all, I set the texture coordinate to object, like so. Scaled it down to 1, upped the depth a lot. I think I had it at like 12 or something. then you play with the distortion until you get nice swirls, which is hard to do just testing and rendering, because the rendering is going pretty slow. I do not have the fastest computer in the world, which can make this very tedious. So I'm going to actually look at my other file right now and copy those settings just to speed things up. Okay, so looking at my other file, this was a depth of 8, a scale of 0.05, and a distortion of 5. So let's take a look at that and see if it worked. Very cool. See, we're getting some nice swirls using the magic texture, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so also looking at my other file, I realized that I did not use 2 emission textures, and I'd like to follow that file because it makes sense. So for the emission, let's go back to rendered mode here. What I did is I took the factor on a color ramp, like so, and plugged that into the emission color. So then we can take the color ramp and create lava colors like so, where the darks, we go from dark to light, like so, and everything in between. So we want some red, and we want some orange. We can tweak this later. But you can see we're getting some nice lava swirls in our emission. So how we break that up then, like in this image, is using some noise textures mixed with the magic texture. So we don't really care about this diffuse guy. We're going to put him over here so we don't accidentally interfere with that. Then we're going to do a texture, noise texture, plug him into the object slot, and we are going to color mix by a factor. And we are going to add this guy to break up the lights of the swirl. We want to break up the lights and the darks of the swirl. Set the detail to about 12 is pretty good. So now you can see already, if we get rid of this, we just have the swirls. If we add it, we have this nice broken up swirly mess. But we want to make this guy a little bit more contrasty as far as breaking stuff up goes. So we're going to use a color ramp and crush this. So we just get some highlights in certain areas, and we can also scale this down to about 3. Scaling it down makes it bigger because this is essentially how many times the texture repeats. So bigger number equals more repetitions equals smaller texture. So smaller number equals less repetitions equals bigger texture. We also want to bring the white in a little bit to break it up a bit more. And then we're going to do the exact same thing with another noise texture. We want to keep the exact same settings on the noise texture, but we're going to add a vector mapping to offset it so we don't completely remove the swirls. So we're just going to change the location of this to offset it, create another mix. This one's going to be multiply, and we are going to multiply. Oh, by the way, we want this to be a factor of 1. So we add it quite a good bit. We add quite a good bit to the mix. Then we're going to take this guy, plug him into the factor for multiply, make it a factor of 1, and then add a color ramp and crush it. Like so. And we want to clamp this, by the way, because that gets it down to 1. So this should be multiplying. I don't know why it's making it, okay, it's not making it brighter. We can tone this down some because it is getting out of hand. I don't even know what that accent was. So now we're getting some nice flamey areas here, like so. We do want some of the dark areas, like the lava has cooled off. And I think we want this to overall be less contrasty, so let's crush the whites a bit less and make this a little bit less. Okay, very cool. So then in our color ramp, we are going to have the orange, the red, and we're also going to add another color. This one will be yellow, like so. so we get some more saturation in the image. We can also lower the saturation just a tad bit, and that gives us some decent looking lava. The rest is accomplished in post or compositing. Also, I think these noises can be scaled down just a little bit. Alright, so that is basically how I accomplished the lava. The swirls were going this way in this one. We can get that same effect by offsetting the magic texture, because I kind of like the way that looks rather than swirling in, rather than swirl out. So we can do a vector mapping, and we can offset on the Z, X, Y. Okay, so we want to offset it on the X-axis. Whoa. So doing this, we can move the texture around essentially until we get something we like. I'll let you play with that as much as you want, but for the meantime, something like, we're just going to keep it at 0, I think. Then if we really want to, we can go into edit mode, and since this is on an object basis, the texture should just slide right along like that. And then go out of render mode, unhide everything, move this guy back like so, and our swirls should look pretty nice. So there was one more factor in the texture, and that is the displacement. Lava will have, along the top, it will have a crust that will form because the lava cools out into rock in certain areas. So we're going to take our dark texture, which is this guy right here, and we're going to test this with a diffuse to get it to look exactly how we want. So this is what our crust is looking like so far. We want to use a color ramp to crush this because we want like very, very obvious sections of crust. Like so. We also want them to be pretty small. Okay, so that will work quite well for our crusty bits. Actually, let's crush this just a little bit more like that. And then we can use this to mix shader mix in our other shader, which will be a mixture of diffuse and glossy. The shader is getting pretty complicated. I hope you all followed along. So we're going to mix these two shaders to get our crust, because the rock will be a little bit shiny. And we want it to be pretty dark, like so, and maybe a little bit red. And the roughness will be like a 0.4, and we'll plug that in right there. And then we will plug in our texture right here. And I got that backwards, so we want the crust to be on the small bits like that. So now we have some nice lava crust, and we can even crush this further if we wanted to remove some of it. What you can do is, rather than crushing it like this or worrying about that, we can change it to constant. So now only the white will affect it. We don't have to worry about the black. Okay, great. So we can copy this color ramp. Now we're going to also make a bump so that the reflections will do a little bit of something. Copy the color ramp and plug it into the displacement. But that will just make flat little mountains, which is not quite what we want. We also want to invert this so that it bumps up. So that will be white, and that will be black. And rather than using constant, we want to use linear again. So that will give us nice bumpies on the crust. And then we can also make this lower contrast so the bump looks correct. Something like that should be fine. Great. So I'm going to pause and give this a quick. Okay, before we render, I just want to show you that I imported the robot that we worked on last week to the scene just so we can get to compositing as fast as possible. And how you do that is you go to the File, Append menu, and you just append all of the objects that make up your robot. See, I went to Robot Tutorial 8 Object, selected everything except the camera and the plane that was our light. Actually, I imported those two, I just deleted them when I imported him. So now I'm going to give this a quick render, and then hopefully we can jump right into compositing. Okay, so on those samples, this is what the render looks like. This is 25%, 200 samples. Like I said, it takes forever to render full resolution, full samples. So we're going to be working with a low resolution image in this project, and then I will let you all render it out as big as you please. So this is what it's looking like so far. There are a couple issues I have with this before we get into compositing. Mostly this gold, also the bump on his face, which I will let you all tweak on your own time. So this gold here needs to be more gold, more yellowy, I think. So let's go ahead and focus on that. Select everything, select linked, material, and this guy, Shift H. So now we can render this and focus on this guy. Also, the world. I used a sky for the world in this, which is technically wrong, but we want this to be black, I think, just so it doesn't affect our image at all. Or hell, why not? You can go to CG Skies and get a sky image for very cheap or for free if you want to use the test ones. I personally used the test ones, so we are going to use environment texture, open. I'm not actually sure where I put that sky either. So I'm going to download okay, I'll just use this for the meantime for a reflection image, and that should be perfectly fine just to give us something. You can really use anything just to add some detail, but let's go back to the rendered view and make these guys a little bit more saturated, I think. Pump the saturation up to 1. Pump the saturation up, and I think that's giving us a much better gold look. So we want to do the exact same thing on our bricks material. Pump the saturation up and pump the saturation up, and then back to our gold material. Pump the saturation up. And then we also want our detail to be more visible. So let's darken this a lot, our noise texture, and then play with how much we're crushing it. Okay, so I'm not seeing much of a change here, not seeing much of the detail. And another problem with that is that we have pure reflection material, basically. We need to add in basically a specular map, which is another thing that I did to break up these specular highlights a little bit. So we're going to do shader, mix shader, shader, diffuse, mix, copy our dark material like so, and then we're going to texture, noise texture, plug that into the factor if the software will respond correctly, which it is not because I'm currently rendering and recording. So now we're getting a little bit of a broken up thing there. Let's up the detail to 12, and then converter, color ramp. I'm gonna have to go out of render here because it's just going way too slow. Okay, now it's actually responding. So let's just select the columns and hide everything else so it will render a bit faster and give us some more memory to work with. We're going to then use a texture coordinate, object, and we're going to crush this and crush this to get our diffuse showing a bit more. So now we're getting a bit more detail in the columns, which is nice. I think we can change this to 4, and I think that is looking all right. I think we can also up the brightness on this guy since we're also breaking up the specular, And I think that will work for the purposes of this image. Let's go ahead and get into compositing. So I'm going to pause while I render out a higher resolution image. Before we render, just a few things. We want to make sure the Z pass is on. And also a material index pass, because we're going to select our robot, select his eye material, and give it a pass index of 1. And then we're also going to select his nose and give that a pass index of 2. And I will explain that when we jump right into the compositing. Also, I think we're going to take our light and give it a bit of an orangey tint, like so, and move it over just a bit, rotate it, just because I want this wall to be a bit lighter. If we look at our previous render, it wasn't very light. And then we can also turn the emission down just a tad bit, I think. So I'm going to find our emission texture right here and put that at 3.5, which should be pretty good. Let's do a render. Okay, still the image was looking way too red when I rendered, so I'm going to actually add some blue to this light and pump it up to 100 and render it. Okay, 100 was too much. I'm going to go down to 80. Okay, as you can see, I don't like how the light is positioned, so we're going to modify that while having only the robots. We can select the robot's overall parent, shift right bracket, right bracket, right bracket until all of the children are selected. Hit select the lights and hit shift H. So then we can do a test render to get him looking how we want. And we're going to hit Control B and just render him out. Go over here into this view, hit Shift F5 to go to the 3D view, and then move the light around until I like it. We can probably even scale it down to make it a bit harder, which when we scale it down, we're going to need up the brightness to probably about 120, should be pretty good. And just move it around until you get something that you like. Again, this image is not going to be perfect. It's probably not going to even be the same as my image originally, but I'm going to show you all of the tricks that I did. Also, I don't like how this guy's nose's reflection is going. This is me tweaking and figuring things out. This is how I work. So, we're going to take off the layer weight and just have it mix. That way we get that nice shiny specular highlight right there. And I think we can take the lava and brighten this guy up just a little bit. And then set the emission to about 4. And then tweak the colors a bit too. And I think that's looking closer to what we want. It's not perfect. It's not how the other image was exactly. I would like more light in the robot's face, honestly. So I think we'll brighten this up to about 150. And then we're just going to jump right into compositing, even though it's not perfect, just because I need to show you the tricks that I used. And I could spend days tweaking this. I really could. But I'd rather show you the neat tricks and then leave it to you to make your image look beautiful. Quick thing, before you render, make sure you undo the border, so you can do that by hitting Control B, selecting the entire render camera area. Okay, so I rendered this image out with 700 samples. It's still very grainy and overall not horribly great looking, but we have enough to work with here for compositing. So let's jump right into that. We're going to use nodes, which will give us this. We're going to select the backdrop, and then if you hit Control Shift and click on something, it will show it in the viewer, which is exactly what you want. So the compositing tricks that I used for this, first and foremost, is to darken the background to bring the subject out. So how we do that is using our depth pass. So we're going to go to Vector, Map Value, and grab the Z and use minimum maximum. That will set the image between 0 and 1. It will not go greater than 1 or less than 0. And we can view that. Then we can start offsetting until the background is separate. Now if we lower this value, it will make it a more gradual change from background to foreground. So I'm going to set this to about 0.05, so now we get a much more gradual change. oh, I was sliding the wrong thing, 0.05, and then we can move this until the subject is separated from the background. Something like that should work. So what we can do with this image now, that the background is white, the foreground is black, we can use a color RGB curves on the image. Let's take a look at that. Then we can plug this value into the factor. So now when we color correct this, it will only color correct the white areas of this image. And we want this to be a little bit stronger, because right now we've darkened this all the way pretty much to 0 and not much has happened, as you can see. So let's go ahead and work on that. We can select this guy. We can color RGB curves to modify him. So we're going to brighten the whites because we want the whites to affect our other curves more, and darken the blacks a little to up the contrast. So we had this, mutes a node, by the way, turns it off, and now we have this. So now if we plug this into the factor of our RGB curves, we should get a much more drastic change. So we're just going to darken the background like that to sort of bring the subject out. I think we can also probably slide this forward just a bit like that, and then take another look at this. So now that is darkening our background, which is exactly what we wanted. So we wanted to do that before we do the defocus. I know that Blender Cycles has built-in depth of field. You can render it out with the depth of field already applied, but then you can't do tricks like this, because you'll get a very grainy Z-depth pass, which we don't want, because it's trying to blur the Z-depth pass, but it's not anti-alias, and it ends up just looking grainy, like a grainy mess. So I always do my depth of field in post, which is a little bit lower quality, but nobody viewing the image will know the difference. So now, because our image wasn't rendered out with more samples and stuff, we're getting a nice edge there. So what we can do to fix that is take this guy and blur him. And we want the blur to be exactly the same when we render out the full resolution image, so we can set this to relative, and that will keep it the same when we render out a larger image. Then a value of about, let's try 1. We just want to blur it out a little bit so to get rid of the aliasing artifacts. So 0.5, 0.5 should do. Again, with a bigger image, this will work better. This is a very small image that we're working with. So we're still getting that highlight right there that we don't want, which should not be an issue in the bigger one, but if it is, what we can do to fix that is before the blur, we can add a filter, dilate, erode. And what that allows us to do is bring in the edges a little bit, so it will color correct just a little bit more, like that. Again, we're working with a low resolution image. It's probably about this big when we're actually viewing it at full size. And for our purposes, this is fine. So this is what we've done so far. We've darkened the background. It's already looking much better, because it just brings the subject out a lot more. So let's go ahead and take a filter, defocus right here, and we'll plug that into the viewer as well, and the composite. And what this allows us to do is blur the background. It takes our Z-pass like that, and then you can change the f-stop. We'll change it down to about, shoot, okay, I screwed up. I'm gonna have to re-render this, so I'm gonna go ahead and pause and render this after I explain why. When you set up your image to use this, you need to set the distance from the camera at which the subject is. So right now it's set to 0. So if we go to the camera and turn on limits, we can see this right here. This is the depth. So we want to set the depth or distance up to the robot, like so. Something right there. So by the way, if you hold shift while you're sliding things, you can slide it at smaller increments. If you don't hold shift, it slides at larger increments. So I'll set the focus to about there. I'm going to pause and re-render this. Okay, so I rendered the image out, and with the current depth of field that I added in compositing, it looks like this. So let's make it look good. The f-stop can go way up. I think something like that. By the way, preview makes it low quality but faster, and turning off preview makes it high quality but slower. So we're just going to tweak the f-stop until we get something we like. Something like that ought to work for me. Keep the image nice and small because it was rendered small. And we are almost done, believe it or not. So, what we can next do is add some nice glow to the lava and to the eyes and to the nose. And how we do that is we take our render layer and put it back where it belongs. By the way, in the compositing editor, if you hit S, it scales all of the nodes together just like it would in the 3D viewport, which is good for organizing. So what we're going to do is take our image and go to Filter, Glare, like so. And we will hit Control-Shift, click on the glare to view it in the viewer node. We want to change this to Fog Glow. And then we want to change the mix factor to 1 so we only get the glare. And change the threshold until we get something that looks about right. And I would say that something like that probably looks about right. So then we can take this and do a color mix, change this to add, and add the glare over our defocused darkened background image. Okay, so this is what this is adding. It's adding a little bit of a glow here. I think I would like to change the size down a little bit, focus it a bit more. And another way you can approach the glare and get more control over it is by doing this. We can take our image and we can do a color RGB curves and crush everything to black that is not the lava. And brighten the lava some, like so. I didn't actually do this in the final image, but now that I go back and think about it, I think it is a good idea to try at least. So we can take this and do a filter blur, again set it to relative so it will be the same when you render out the full size image. Then we can up this to about 10 by 10. After we do color mix, you can use the mix node. There is no setup clamp node, but you can use the mix node to clamp stuff before you blur it so it's not blurring like a super bright image. And then we can take this and add it over, and we might get better results. We can probably tone down the blur a bit, maybe 5 by 5. And that gives us a nice glow on the lava. And the other glare that I used is I used the streaks as well, because that gives us some nice like lava fire look kind of. So we can change the fade down some, and then also add Shift D to copy the node to make another add node, and then mix that over as well. So we get this nice glare, and we can change the factor down to like 0.8 or 0.6 because we don't want it so strong on the eyes, just on this. And now the reason that we did the mask or the index mask is for this reason. We can do an ID mask node, plug the material, index material, into the ID mask node, and this allows us to separate out the different masks that we made. So what I was going to do with this is make the eyes glow, which is already happening because they're already bright enough, but I also want to make the nose glow. So let's set this to a factor of 2, turn on anti-aliasing, and then we're going to multiply this, color, mix, multiply, over the image. And what this does is it's pre-multiplying the image, basically. We're basically using this as an alpha and pre-multiplying it over the image so we get just the nose inside the mask. And what this then allows us to do is take this, let's organize just a little bit here so everything doesn't look so confusing. By the way, multiplying takes a black and white image and it multiplies the pixel values. So black is 0, white is 1, so 0 times anything is 0, which gives us black, and then white times anything is, or 1 times anything is itself, so 1 times whatever the nose pixel values are gives us just the nose. So then we can take this color mix and adding adds the pixel values, which is why we get these super bright cool looking areas, and we will add the nose over, which right now just brightens the nose, but what we want to do is then take our nose and filter blur it, relatively by a factor of, let's say, 2, maybe 3, and then add that over the image. And that'll give us a nice nose glow. I still think we can turn down the streaks more to maybe 0.3 or 0.2. We just want a little bit there. And that is looking pretty swell. And to final things off, we're going to add a nice vignette to focus on the subject more. And how I approach that is I input an RGB, I distort it to scale it down to, first of all, plug this into the image slot. I distort it to scale it down to the render size, like so. Then we take that and we distort it with a lens distort by a factor of 1. And then we mix that. Color mix over anything will give us a black background, because we're essentially eliminating the alpha that was already here and just giving it black and then mixing it over white. If we want the alpha involved, then we can set this to black, but I might as well just leave it off. This turns on alpha for the mix. This keeps it off. Turns it on or off. It toggles it on or off. So then we have this nice circle anyway. And then I take this and I do a filter blur, again, relative, maybe 10 by 10, maybe 20 by 20. That's pretty nice. If we don't like how this cuts off like that, we can, before we blur it, before we mix it, we can do a distort scale and scale it down so that the circle does not get clipped. And then we blur it out, it will look all nice. So then we take this and we do a color invert because we want to color correct the exterior. A lot of people will just multiply the vignette over, and that is all wrong. I'm sorry, it's just straight up wrong, and I'm about to show you why. So we can take this and do an RGB curves by a factor of the vignette, and that way when we darken it, sure, we can darken the edges, which is all fun and games, but the beauty of having it as a factor to a color correct is then we can add a little bit of color into the vignette, so we can like redden up the edges to make it look more foreboding. Or we can take some blue out to make it more yellow, which there's no blue in this image anyway except the jetpack. I think we can turn the blur factor down to maybe 25 by 25 to harden up that edge just a little bit. But anyway, you can see that we're color correcting just the edges, and that really brings out the character. So let's take a look. Let's go ahead and add a Shift-A search switch. We can plug the image into off and our final output into 1, and this is just to view the difference. So this is what we started with, crappy, grainy, really low res render, and this is what we're ending with, something that looks pretty decent, and it's still grainy and bad quality just because I didn't get a chance to render it out full samples because that would have taken a really long time. And there's other stuff I would like to tweak, like the gold material is not quite there, and the bump on him and his material is not quite there. But I'll leave that up to you all, because I think that you all are fully capable of doing something like that. I mean, all of the nodes that I created are in place for you, just have to tweak the values. So I hope that this tutorial was educational and you learned something in it, and stay tuned for Tutorial Tuesdays next week as well. This has been Tutorial Tuesdays episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe if you enjoyed it, and watch more tutorials as they come out every week. That is all.